In today's video, you will hear some of the most scariest things some people have ever experienced. If you like my content, do like and subscribe. I am creating content to try to raise funds for my dad's treatment. So if you want to support his ongoing battle, the GoFundMe link is in the description section below. Thank you so much for being here. And now, let's get started. Story 1. We got my grandma an alarm system after some unsettling incidents. Teenagers broke into her house. And before that, someone had been living in her basement without her even knowing. The new system came with exterior cameras and motion sensors that took pictures of anyone entering the house. We thought she'd be safe now. One day, I got a call from her at work. Her phone went off, alerting her that motion was detected inside her house. That was strange since she lived alone. She immediately assumed someone had broken in. But what bothered me most was that the alarm hadn't gone off, meaning this person must have been in the house before she set the alarm. When she checked the footage, she was shocked. There, rummaging through her fridge, was her deceased brother-in-law. He had fallen into a deep depression after his daughter died and his wife left him. One morning, he took a gun to the lake and ended his life. Before all that, he used to visit every weekend, helping my grandma's ex-husband with their basement remodel. He'd always raid the fridge for snacks while he was there. Story 2. This is something I've never been able to rationalize. After my dad passed away in 2002, we started getting landline calls where no one would answer on the other end. Robocallers weren't as common back then, so we chalked it up to wrong numbers or something. We didn't even have caller ID at the time, so we couldn't tell who was calling. One day, after getting yet another call with nothing but silence, I jokingly said, "Dad, if that's you, call my cell phone." I didn't think much of it. Back then, I rarely got calls on my cell, and spam calls were practically unheard of. I was 18 with an unlisted number that only close family and a few friends had. A few minutes later, my phone rang an unfamiliar number. With what I'd just said lingering in my mind, I freaked out and didn't answer. I was about to head out with my mom, so once we were in the car, I told her what had happened. We decided to call the number back. It didn't ring. Instead, there was muffled static, followed by the slow, deliberate sound of numbers being dialed. It was so strange. Both my mum and I said hello a few times, but there was no response, just that eerie dialing noise. I've never had anything like that happen before or since. Story 3. This isn't my story, but my mum's. A close friend of hers once called, completely frantic, convinced her house was haunted. My mum, being a scientist and a natural skeptic, wasn't exactly sold on the idea. Still, she agreed to visit and check things out. Her friend was adamant either her house was haunted or she was losing her mind, and she needed help either way. When my mum arrived, her friend started showing her what had been happening. First stop, the living room. There was a shiny brass lamp, the kind you could see the reflection of the kitchen in if you looked closely. The friend asked my mum to just focus on the lamp's reflection. As she did, my mum saw a shadowy figure of a man stepping out from behind the wall. She turned around instantly. Nothing was there. The same thing happened over and over again, reflection in the lamp, shadowy figure, but no one behind her. Next, they went into her son's bedroom. With the lights off and the door closed, they left the hallway light on, casting a strip of light under the door. As they watched, two shadowy feet clearly stepped in front of the door, blocking out the light. But when they opened the door, nothing. Again, the same eerie shadow feet reappeared when they closed the door. Finally, they went to her bedroom. My mum's friend fluffed up the comforter, and as it settled back on the bed, there it was, a distinct indentation, as if someone had just sat down on the bed. She fluffed it up again, and the same thing happened. It repeated every time they tried. My mum, despite all her skepticism, couldn't find a rational explanation for any of it. Soon after, her friend went to a medium who told her it wasn't the house that was haunted, was her furniture. The pieces were second-hand, bought at a garage sale. So, she got rid of the furniture, and just like that, the paranormal activity stopped. Story 4. The Angels on the Mountain. I live in Vermont, pretty close to the Canadian border, and my family owns a good chunk of a mountain behind our house. Ever since I was a kid, I've loved hiking up there and camping. But after a few uncomfortable encounters with coyotes and bears at night, I decided to build a small shack for camping. It wasn't much, just a basic log cabin I built with moose maple during my freshman year of high school. It was rough, but it got the job done, especially with some roofing to keep out the rain. Over time, my camp became a popular hangout spot for my friends and me. We'd hike up, shoot guns, and blow things up, typical teenage stuff. Being so far away from any town was liberating, but it also meant we had to take care of ourselves if anything went wrong. One Friday night after school, I invited a close friend to come camping with me. We'd been friends since middle school, so he'd been up there many times before. After the hike up, we settled in, roasting hot dogs by the fire and listening to music as the sun went down. As always, once it got dark, you could hear wildlife moving around in the woods. At first, the sounds had always creeped me out, but over time, I got used to it. Nothing bad had ever happened, and I always had a gun with me, just in case, so I felt safe. Once we were full and ready to sleep, we headed into the shack. It was nothing fancy, about 10 by 12 feet, with a homemade bunk bed, some floor space, a counter, and a small wood stove. I took the top bunk, and my friend took the bottom. We fell asleep pretty fast. But then, sometime around 1 a.m., we both woke up at the same time. It wasn't an animal or anything like that. It was the sound of a church choir. And not just any choir, it sounded like 30 or 40 people singing right outside the camp. The music was clear, almost angelic, and somehow resonating in my head. I could make out some of the words, which sounded like Latin, but I couldn't fully understand them. I asked my friend if his phone was on, thinking it might be playing music, but he said it was dead. The weirdest part of the whole experience, neither of us was scared. In fact, it was soothing, and despite how bizarre it was, we both eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, we checked around the camp, no signs of people, let alone a group of 40. We were 10 miles away from the nearest town, and the entire area was still and quiet. I still think about that night all the time, and I've come to refer to that choir as the Angels, because of how otherworldly it sounded. It never happened again, and to this day, I have no explanation for it. But at least I have my friend to back up the story. Otherwise, I'd think I was going crazy. Story 5. The Doppelganger. In Spain, a group of friends and I were on a rock climbing trip in Spain, staying at this really eerie Airbnb. It was the kind of place where the air felt heavy, and strange things kept happening the entire time we were there. But the creepiest moment for me came one morning as we were getting ready for the day, packing up food, and sorting out our gear. I went upstairs to grab something, and, as I was heading back down, I walked past my friend's boyfriend on the landing. He turned and went into his and my friend's room. I'm pretty sure I even asked him something, but he didn't reply. I just thought, wow, rude, and continued downstairs. When I walked into the kitchen, there he was sorting food with my friend, as if he'd been there the whole time. I was completely confused. Everyone swore he hadn't left the kitchen. And considering there was only one staircase, it would have been impossible for him to have passed me without me noticing. Just to make sure I wasn't losing it, I went back upstairs to check their room, and there was no one up there but me. I'm not someone who easily buys into paranormal stuff, but after that trip, I'm not so sure. It wasn't just this one event, there were several other things that spooked me during our stay. It's the only time in my life I've experienced something so unexplainable, and it still gives me chills when I think about it. Story 6. Encounters with the Unseen. When I was a kid, I visited my dad's friend's farm in Ireland. One afternoon, I was upstairs taking a shower, and after I finished, I went into the bedroom to get dressed. I casually glanced out the window and saw a man walking by. He wore a long coat and a suit, like something straight out of the 1920s. It didn't strike me as odd at the time, I just figured it was a normal person passing by. About 30 minutes later, I was downstairs, and I asked about the man I'd seen. My dad's friend, with a curious smile, asked me what the man was wearing. I described the coat and the suit, and he just nodded, completely unfazed, and said, "That's the ghost who lives here." He said it so casually, like it was no big deal. I've never forgotten that moment. Even now, I can replay it in my head perfectly. Years later, I asked my dad about it, and he told me, "Liam's been talking about that ghost since he was a kid." That wasn't my only strange experience though. I stayed with a Cambodian family in Los Angeles for a few months, and one night I woke up to something bizarre. The computer chair in the room was spinning on its own, and the room felt breezy. But here's the thing, there was no fan on, no windows open, nothing to explain the breeze or the chair moving. I've never been able to make sense of that one either. Story 7. The Little Girl in Pink. About 10 years ago, when I was 24, I was still living with my parents. My bedroom was in the basement, and one night, around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of a young child crying. It sounded like it was coming from just outside my window. The thing is, my window was covered in ivy, so I couldn't see out. Concerned, I jumped out of bed, thinking I needed to help this kid. But as I got closer to my bedroom door, I realized something unsettling. The crying wasn't outside. It was coming from just beyond my door. I hesitated for a moment, but I opened the door anyway. No one was there, and the crying stopped. Spooked, I rushed back to bed, my heart racing. The moment I got under the covers, the crying started again. Later that day, at dinner, I decided to tell my family what had happened. As I shared the experience, my older sister chimed in with a story of her own. She explained that when she was younger, she used to leave her room at night to sleep with our parents, because she often saw a little girl walking out of her closet. She'd get to our parents' bedroom door and wait to be let in, but the door was always locked. While she stood there, she would see the little girl walking up the nearby stairs. As she finished her story, my younger sister went pale. With a shaky voice, she asked the little girl, was she wearing a pink nightgown and had shoulder-length brunette hair? My older sister froze. Yes, that's exactly what she looked like. My younger sister then revealed that she'd had similar encounters. The little girl would either emerge from her closet at night, or she'd catch glimpses of her walking up those same stairs. At that moment, I became convinced that something had happened in that house or on the land it was built on. I don't know what, but there was something tied to that little girl in the pink nightgown, and all of us had experienced it in one way or another. Story 8. The Floating Head. It was late at night, and I was putting beef in the slow cooker, because I wanted it ready for the morning. I reached up to grab some seasonings, when I suddenly heard creaking. Assuming it was my kids, I called out, telling them to get back in bed. As I continued with the spices, something caught my attention from the corner of my eye. When I turned, my heart nearly stopped there. Floating about 3.5 to 4 feet off the ground was the head of a bald, pale man. No body, just a head, hovering in the middle of the room. His face, it looked so sad, almost like it was pleading. And then, it locked eyes with me. ... I froze. Behind the floating head was a dark wall with a coat rack where my husband's work jackets hung, making it stand out even more. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but when I glanced back, it was still there staring. I panicked and bolted out the back door, too terrified to pass by it on my way upstairs where my husband and kids were. I ended up calling my husband from my phone, asking him to come down and walk me inside. I wasn't tired, I wasn't on any medication, and I have no reason to ever see something like that. Yet there it was, clear as day. Story 9. The Mirror. The scariest experience I ever had was probably when I was around 11 or 12. I went to a friend's house to hang out, but when I got there, she was sitting outside, totally freaked out. She told me a mirror in her room kept trying to kill her. Once she calmed down a little, she took me upstairs to her room and said, "Watch this." There was a big square mirror on top of her dresser, leaning back against the wall. She bent over like she was going to open the bottom drawer, and that's when I saw it. This mirror stood up on its own, slowly tipping forward until it was no longer resting against the wall. Then it rolled as much as a square ka-thunk, ka-thunk, ka-thunk until it toppled off the dresser, landing on the floor just half an inch from her head. The mirror didn't even break when it hit the ground. My friend looked at me with this "you saw that, right?" expression, put the mirror back up, and we both bolted out of the room. After that, her mum moved the mirror out of her room, and as far as I know, nothing creepy like that ever happened again. But it was definitely unsettling to witness. On a lighter note, my family had what we believe was the ghost of a little girl living with us for several years when we rented a house in Tennessee. She wasn't creepy, just the usual unsettling vibe that comes with a ghost child hanging around. We would often catch glimpses of her out of the corner of our eyes. And sometimes my wife and I would feel her climb into bed with us, like little kids do when they want to snuggle. Late at night, we'd see the kids' computer chair swivel on its own, and the computer would boot up, loading play or educational websites. One of the coolest moments was when we got our first cat. She was a stray we took in, and one evening, the entire family was in the living room, letting the cat explore the house. The cat wandered down the hall toward the back of the house, and we all heard it clear as day a little girl's delighted giggle, followed by "Kitty," coming from down the hall. We moved away from that house about 7 years ago, but I still think about that little ghost girl, and hope whoever's living there now is nice to her. She mostly just seemed lonely. Story 10. The Silent Family. When I was around 8, I had a friend who drove me crazy for the weirdest reason. Every time I called out to her from another room, she would never answer. Instead, she'd silently walk into the room and respond only then. It freaked me out. She'd just pop up out of nowhere, scaring me half to death. The thing was, her entire family did this. I figured it was some sort of politeness thing, like how my aunt would get mad if I yelled "what?" instead of saying yes when she called me. One day, I asked my friend why she never simply called back when I yelled for her. She just shrugged and said, "That's how we roll." When I pointed out that her parents and siblings did it too, she gave the same answer. "They roll like that too." I thought they were just a weird family. Then, one day, I was over at her house when her dad was at work, and her mum had taken her brothers to hockey practice. Her mum left us alone because she knew we wouldn't tear the place apart like the boys would. We were upstairs doing some crafts when I heard someone call my friend's name from downstairs. It happened twice, but she didn't seem to notice. I told her what I heard, and we both listened. A few moments later, we heard it again, someone faintly calling her name. This time, it sounded like it was coming from the garage. I told her, "Your mum's back. Go ask her what she wants." But, true to form, she quietly got up and walked all the way downstairs, instead of just yelling back. I followed her, irritated. Why walk all the way there when we could just shout? We searched the garage, and the first floor, no one was there. The doors and windows were still locked. I was getting weirded out, but my friend acted like it was no big deal. She casually grabbed some ice cream from the fridge, and we went to sit on the doorstep outside to eat. I asked her what the hell was going on, and that's when she finally explained. She said that in her culture, they believed demons could mimic the voices of loved ones to lure you to them. The only way to protect yourself was to avoid answering, which is why her family always came into the room to check before responding. Now I was totally freaked out. I asked, half panicked, what if the demon can look like them too? Like, Even if you see them, it's not really them. That's when she got scared. Her face went pale, and she started to cry, saying she hadn't thought about that before. We both bolted down the street to another friend's house and refused to go back until her mum came home. Story 11. The Vanishing Hours. In 1991, when I was 15, my mum reluctantly let me off a 2-week grounding to watch a movie at a friend's house on a school night. The movie would finish at 9 p.m, and I had to be home by 9:30, sharp or face another week of grounding. After the movie ended, I said my goodbyes and left, noting that it was just after 9. The walk home should have only taken 10 minutes through the quiet suburban streets. About halfway home, a large German shepherd appeared out of nowhere, growling and blocking my path. I crossed the road to avoid it, but it reappeared in front of Minnow barking, just snarling and watching me. I zigzagged through the streets, trying to shake it, but every time I turned, there it was again, as if it was waiting for me. Finally, I broke into a sprint, my heart racing, as the dog followed me, never running, just walking, growling, and keeping pace. Completely out of breath, I reached my front door, knocked, and my mum opened with a furious look. "Where have you been? It's 11 p.m, she snapped. I couldn't believe it. There was no way it was that late. I left my friend's house right after 9, so I should have been home long before 9:30. I tried to explain about the dog, but she didn't believe me. She had already called my friend's parents, and they confirmed that I'd left around 9. But somehow, 2 hours had passed, and I couldn't account for any of it. We checked every clock in the house, and they all read 11 p.m. My mum even called the speaking clock to confirm the time. It was still 11. To this day, 30 years later, I have no explanation for those missing hours, or the strange dog that seemed to follow me from nowhere. Story 12. The Rattling at Closing Time. I used to work at a restaurant that had a unique feature: a wall of windows that lifted like a garage door to create a faux patio. It was a solid structure, rattling fiercely whenever it was opened or closed. Facing a busy street, it usually stayed down after hours. One night, as I was finishing up my closing duties around 11 p.m, the place was completely empty. The cooks and dishwasher were long gone. Outside, it was dark, and the only lights came from the restaurant across the street. After turning off most of the lights and grabbing my stuff from the back, I heard a rattling sound, like someone shaking the garage door. I poked my head out, expecting to see a late-night customer or maybe someone drunk, but the second I looked, the noise stopped. No one was there. I brushed it off as wind or a passing truck. But as I turned back to grab my keys, the rattling started again. I stepped out into the dining room, but once again, it stopped as soon as I looked. I saw nothing but my own reflection in the dark windows. I went back to the back room, more annoyed than spooked. As soon as I turned the lights off, the rattling returned. Frustrated, I called out, "I'm not doing this tonight. I'm tired. Just let me lock up and leave." And just like that, it stopped. I walked out to the back door that led to a dark parking lot, ready to leave. But when I turned around to lock up, I froze. Standing at the garage door was a figure. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. I locked the door and got out of there as fast as I could. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was just having a smoke, or maybe it was the wind. But the restaurant backed onto an old city hall with a jail underground. And sometimes I remember how old that area is, how many stories it holds, and I'm just glad I quit that job when I did. Story 13. Cyrus, the Friendly House Ghost. We've always joked about having a house ghost named Cyrus. It's a running gag since we found out from our house deeds that the first man to live here, in 1907, was named Cyrus. Whenever something goes missing and shows back up later, we say it's him, displeased with our decor choices, or just messing with us. It's all in good fun. My boyfriend and I are skeptics, so we never took it seriously. But a few months ago, something strange happened. I swear, I was fast asleep in bed when suddenly, I heard a man's voice say hello right next to my ear. It was soft and polite, almost like a gentle nudge to wake me up. I jolted awake, fully expecting to see someone standing there. Of course, no one was. Here's the thing. My boyfriend woke up at the exact same moment and said what? As if he had heard it too. We both sat there, confused but not scared. It was so clear, like someone had leaned in to greet me. The weirdest part, I wasn't frightened. I've never been a fan of ghost stories or horror movies, but this, it felt different. Whatever it was, sounded kind and polite, almost friendly. So, I guess Cyrus really is just a pal maybe. He's just checking in on us. We're not worried. If we do have a ghost, it seems we've got one we can trust. Story 14. The mysterious crying. This one isn't my story, but my mum's, from when I was just a baby. Apparently, I was always a calm sleeper, rarely made a peep at night. But one evening, while my mum had a friend over, they both started hearing a baby crying from upstairs. Naturally, they rushed up to check on me, only to find me sound asleep, not making a sound. They shrugged it off and went back downstairs, but the crying started again. The strange part was, every time they went up, I was still perfectly calm, still asleep. The crying, however, sounded off, not quite right somehow. It happened more than once, but they couldn't figure it out. One night, my mum and dad were downstairs watching TV when they heard it again. This time, they paid closer attention. That's when they realized what was truly eerie. The crying wasn't coming from my room at all. It was coming from the opposite side of the house, the room with the latch to the attic. Creepy stuff, right? And honestly, I'm not surprised. I've always said this place is haunted. I even once heard my mum call my name from downstairs. An old problem was, I was home alone. Story 15. The silent silhouettes. When I was a kid, my mum took my sister and me on vacation. We stayed in a small hotel where the rooms were mostly flats, with just one bedroom. My sister had the pull-out sofa while I shared the bed with my mum. I can't recall whether I was trying to fall asleep or if I'd woken up, but I do remember it being late. Everyone else was asleep, and the room was bathed in a faint glow from the street lights seeping through the curtains. That's when I noticed them. On either side of the bed stood two dark silhouettes. They didn't move or make a sound, but I could feel their presence, like they were staring directly at me. Strangely, I didn't feel scared or threatened. Instead, I turned on the bedside lamp. As expected, no one was there, but when I turned the light back off, they reappeared, standing in the exact same positions. I just watched them for a while, eventually drifting off to sleep. The next morning at breakfast, I casually mentioned what I'd seen. That's when my sister chimed in, saying she'd felt like she was being watched all night too. It's a memory that stuck with me ever since, though I've never been able to explain it. That is all for today. If you have enjoyed this video, do like and subscribe, and let me know below of your thoughts. If you want to help in my dad's fundraiser, I would truly appreciate it. Hope you have an absolutely amazing day. You can also check my other videos on screen.